Alrighty, so welcome back, folks. In this video, I'm going to go through the solutions to the IB Economics Higher Level Paper 3. This is the May 2024 paper. Now, today I'm going to look at question 2. I've already done question 1 in a previous video, so if you haven't checked that out, you might want to check that out. But in this video, I'm going to look at question 2 only. So let's get started. So here in question 2, it's a question about Turkey's economy. So let's have a quick read at the backstory of the information that we've been given. So we're told that the economy of Turkey has faced a number of challenges since 2018. Foreign investors have sold their financial assets, such as bonds and stocks. Turkey's currency, the Turkish lira, has depreciated, while inflation has risen sharply. However, the economy has somehow managed to grow. Turkey has a strong business culture with a large proportion of the population aspiring to be entrepreneurs. It has also benefited from supply chain constraints in other parts of the world, which have created opportunities for Turkish firms. And sort of somewhere in the middle, we can see they've got this table, and it contains a whole bunch of economic indicators for Turkey across 3 different years, 2020, 2021, and 2022. And these indicators include things like GDP, the GDP deflator, CPI, and the population. Okay, so good, great. What do we have to do? So in the first bit, in part A, part 1, I guess, we've been told to using the information in table 2, calculate the real GDP per capita. So we need to go real GDP per capita in Turkish lira for 2021. So essentially, we're going to be looking at this column of figures, right, that second 2021 column. And what we have to do specifically is we need to get the real GDP per capita. Okay, so the way we calculate real GDP per capita, first off is we need to get real GDP. So here we've been given this figure of GDP in billions of Turkish lira. Now this, as in 2022, the GDP is 7,207 billion Turkish lira. This is a nominal GDP. So if you recall, nominal GDP is not the preferred measure because it has inflation kind of like mixed into it. It hasn't really taken into account the effects of inflation. So in order to remove those inflation effects, we have to take the nominal GDP and we have to divide it by the GDP deflator in order to derive the real GDP. So that's what we have down here. In order to calculate the real GDP, we take the nominal GDP and we divide it by the deflator in that particular year. And so the nominal GDP in 2021 was 7,207, and the GDP deflator was 235.2. So we take that, take 7,207, divide by 235.2, multiply by 100 because it's an, need to get the index back somehow, and we end up with a real GDP of 3,064.2 billion Turkish lira. So that's the first half of the calculation. It's just getting the real GDP figure. The second part is to get the actual, now that we've got real GDP, we need to get real GDP per capita. And this is actually the easy bit because once we have real GDP, we just take the population and divide real GDP by the population to derive real GDP per capita. So this is the formula down here. We take our GDP and we divide it by the population, and that's going to give us real GDP per capita. So the only thing you have to be a little bit careful with here. This is where things get a little bit, well, one tiny little thing you have to be aware of is real GDP is measured in billions, whereas population is measured in millions. So a billion is like 1,000 million, right? So if the GDP is like 1 billion, that's not 1 million, it's actually 1,000 million. So you have to take that billion and multiply it by 1,000 in order to get it into the same units of measurement as population, right? So if I take 3064.2, so if I just take this figure here, real GDP, and we divide it by the population of 85.04 million, that would be incorrect because the real GDP is measured in billions, whereas population is measured in millions. So we essentially have to take that 3064.2, multiply it by 1,000, and then divide by 85.04, and that's going to give us real GDP per units of Turkish lira. Okay, so that's the only thing that to be a little bit conscious about. So you take that 3064.2, multiply by 1,000, and then we divide by 85.04, and that should give us a real GDP per capita of 36,032 Turkish lira. And if you have any space, then it's good practice just to provide like a little one sentence, just to answer the question. The real GDP per capita in 2021 is 36,032 Turkish lira. Okay, so just as I mentioned, the only sort of tricky thing to just be aware of is converting those billions into millions. Okay, let's move on to the next bit. So in part 2, where we've been asked to use the information in table 2 to calculate Turkey's rate of inflation for 2022. Okay, so to get inflation, we essentially take the percentage change in the CPI. So in this third row, we have the CPI, and the CPI in 2021 is 558.7, and the CPI in 2022 is 1,003. So to get the percentage change, we take the 1,003 minus the 558.7, and then we divide it by 558.7 times 100, and that's going to give us the inflation rate. Or you can simply, if you want, you can just take 1,003 and divide it by 558. That works to take the ratio of the two things. So what I've got here is kind of got more the traditional way to calculate inflation, or to calculate the percentage change, which is that we take the delta, so CPI in 2022, minus CPI in 2021, and then we divide it by CPI in 2021 times 100 just to turn it back into percentage, and that's going to give us the inflation rate. Okay, so 1,003 minus 558.7 divided by 558.7 times 100 will give us an inflation rate of 79.52%. So if you've got the time and space for it, just answer the question and say, by the way, the rate of inflation for 2022 is 79.52%. So it's a 2-marker. You probably get 1 mark for correctly identifying the equation, and another mark for actually just doing the calculation itself. Okay, so that's part A, part 2 done. Let's move on to the next bit. So on the next page, we have this table, and it provides information on the real GDP per capita for Turkey and the real GDP per capita at purchasing power parity, PPP, in December 2021. So you can see you've got two figures, 13,251, that's the real GDP per capita in US dollars, and down here, 31,252, that's the real GDP per capita at purchasing power parity, PPP. Okay, so what do we have to do? Well, question part 3, using the information in table 3 to illustrate your answer, outline why GDP data is often presented with an adjustment to purchasing power parity, PPP. Okay, so the reason why we take PPP is to account for differences in relative purchasing power. If you were to look at GDP per capita, here it says, Turkey's got a GDP per capita of 13,051. That doesn't sound like a lot, but when you take into account the fact that $1 in Turkey will buy more goods and services than $1 in, let's say, the USA, then we have to adjust for that difference in relative purchasing power. Okay, so $1 in Turkey is worth more than, so $1 in Turkey is worth more, quote unquote, than $1 in potentially other parts of the world. So we have to adjust for that difference in purchasing power, and hence that's the reason why we have the PPP adjustment. Okay, so how do you explain that? So essentially, you just kind of need to, again, you need to be as brief as possible because they don't give you a lot of space. So this is what I've said. If GDP per capita is measured only with exchange rates, it can underestimate real purchasing power in countries where the cost of living is lower. In Turkey, $13,251 may buy more goods and services than the same amount in other countries. So Turkey's PPP adjusted GDP per capita is 31,252, which is more than double its unadjusted value. So something to that effect, if you can just kind of mention, just something to that effect will be sufficient to answer the crux of the question. So the main thing is you want to mention something about differences in the cost of living, and how if you don't adjust for that, then you can either underestimate or overestimate real purchasing power based on those differences. Cool. Okay, let's move on to the next part. Alrighty, so in the next part of this question, we've got this table 4, and it shows us a bunch of development indicators for Turkey from 2013 to 2019. So we've got 4 years worth of data, and you've got things like gross national income, GNI per capita, CO2 emissions, life expectancy, etc., etc. Okay, so what do we have to do? Down here, part four, using the information in table 4, explain one reason why an increase in GNI per capita might have a positive impact on living standards, and one reason why it might have a negative effect. Okay, so one positive and one negative, and so we need to use the statistics in the table to try to sort of to support our argument. So if we look at this table, we've got a whole bunch of indicators, things like life expectancy. So more life expectancy is a good thing. And we have, let's say, expected years of schooling. Again, more years of schooling, that's a good thing as well. Then you've got other things like CO2 emissions, which I guess you can say are necessarily a bad thing. And maybe sort of down here, actually, I'll just pick the CO2 emissions because that seems like the easiest thing to explain. Right, so we're going to pick one. So the argument here is that GNI per capita has been rising, right? From 2013, it was 23,937. And once we get to 2019, it's like 27,987. So there's been some improvement in the income in the per capita income levels. So by the way, GNI, if you don't know, it's kind of like similar to GDP, but it also includes foreign sort of other income sources as well. So it's kind of like a more complete version of GDP per capita, if you will. So typically we might use GNI per capita because it includes other measures that are not captured in GDP per capita. Anyway, the point is there's been some improvement in GNI per capita, and then we have to discuss one positive thing and one negative thing. So here, you can pick whatever positive thing you want to, which indicator you think tells a positive message. And I'm going to choose expected years of schooling because this is an easy one. So we see from 2013 to 2019, the expected years of schooling have gone from 16.46 to 18.34 years. So as GNI per capita has risen, we also see an improvement in the number of years of schooling. So each person is getting more years of education, and that's going to improve their job opportunities and the potential life outcomes, et cetera, because more education typically is linked to these things. So that's going to be the one positive thing. And then I'm going to have to pick one negative thing. For me, an easy one to pick is the CO2 emissions. So here, as our GNI per capita has risen, we see that CO2 emissions have also risen from 4.19 to 4.76 metric tons per person. So at the same time that we're earning more, we're also, putting more pollutants into the environment, which is not a good thing. Okay, so we have a relatively short amount of space to make an argument. So I recommend kind of just having one section to describe the positive and then one section to describe the negative. So this is what I've said. So for the positive, from 2013 to 2019, GNI per capita at PPP levels has increased from 23,937 to 27,948, while expected years of schooling have increased from 16.46 to 18.34 years. As real GNI per capita grows, households and the government have more resources to spend on education, which leads to better job opportunities and long-term economic development. Okay, so that's, as about as succinct as I can get it. So that's the positive thing. Now, for the negative thing, I've just picked CO2 emissions. So here I've said CO2 emissions have increased from 4.19 to 4.76 metric tons per capita, suggesting that economic growth may have contributed to industrial expansion and higher energy use, leading to environmental harm. So again, just got to pick one positive, one negative. These were the two easiest ones I could think of. You could easily talk about things like life expectancy if you wanted to, or the percentage of population living on less than $5.50 per day. You can see that's, that's a positive thing. So one positive, one negative. As long as you can tell a story around that, that's sufficient. So you get 2 markers. Obviously, I think you get 2 marks for the positive and 2 marks for the negative thing. But keep it to within the word limit. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so just below that part 4, we've got a bit of text over here. In August 2022, Turkey surprised many economists by cutting its rate of interest despite extremely high rate of inflation. The central bank has been expected to keep the interest rate at 14%, but instead lowered it to 13%, expressing concern about the possibility of slowing economic growth. The Turkish currency has fallen more than 25% in 2022, as high inflation and deep concern over the central bank's monetary policy have prompted foreign investors to take their investments out of the country. Turkey's policy contrasts with other countries where central banks have raised interest rates in order to reduce inflation. Okay, sure. What do we have to do about that? Well, let's go a little bit further down here. This is where the question continues. Turkey reported a 1.1 billion Turkish lira budget deficit for June 2022, an increase of 24.3% compared to the previous year. Government spending increased by an annual 87.1% in the same period, while transfer payments more than doubled to 8 billion Turkish lira. Wage costs for government employees rose by an annual 58.7%. Okay, sure. It's a whole bunch of words here. Actually, a lot of it's kind of not really that useful. The question really only begins over here. So outline why there's concern over the central bank's monetary policy. The concern essentially comes from the fact that they've already got high inflation. And typically, to combat high inflation, what you want to do is you want to use contractionary monetary policy in order to raise interest rates, because that's going to lower investment levels and it'll kind of take some of the steam out of the demand side, and then aggregate demand will fall, and that's going to bring inflation levels down through our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, right? So the concern here is if you have high inflation, then one way to combat that high inflation is to raise interest rates. But according to the backstory, like this, all the stuff over here, rather than raising interest rates, they actually lowered interest rates from 14 to 13%. So they're doing the exact opposite of what they should be doing. Rather than sort of taking fuel out of the engine, they're chucking more petrol into the engine, as it were, and they're speeding the economy up, and that potentially has inflationary effects. Okay, so we just somehow need to explain that in like 4 lines or less, right? So this is what I've written, and again, keep in mind that as you're answering these questions, try to invoke as much of the theory as possible. The more sort of models and theories that you can kind of lean on, the more you're demonstrating to the examiners that you actually know what you're talking about. Right, so I've started off by saying, look, aggregate demand is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX, right? So you know this. A decrease in interest rates can stimulate investment and consumption by reducing the cost of borrowing. This will stimulate aggregate demand and place upward pressure on inflation, further contributing to Turkey's high levels of inflation. So, yeah, exactly what we discussed. Rather than raising interest rates, increasing interest rates, which is what they should be doing, they actually decrease interest rates. That in turn will stimulate investment and consumption, and therefore raise aggregate demand, and that puts pressure on inflation. If you had space, you might want to mention sort of something like via the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. But yeah, I mean, there's quite limited space here. So I think it's safe to assume that the examiners know that we're referring to that model. Okay, so that's part 5. If we now move on to part 6, which is just a little bit down here, it's asking us to use an exchange rate, or using an exchange rate diagram, explain how a relatively high rate of domestic inflation is likely to affect the exchange rate for the Turkish lira. Okay, so main thing we should start off with is the exchange rate diagram, and then we need to talk about how inflation is going to affect the exchange rate. Okay, so you should be familiar with this. The way the exchange rate diagram works is we have the exchange rate on the vertical axis, and then we have the quantity of the currency that's being traded on the horizontal axis. So similar to like a regular kind of supply and demand diagram, except that instead of having the price on the vertical axis, we have the exchange rate instead. And just like a regular supply and demand, we have a supply curve. In this case, we have the supply for Turkish lira, TRY, and we have a demand curve, which in this case is going to be the demand for Turkish lira, D sort of TRY1, or whatever notation works for you. Okay, and so in equilibrium, where supply crosses demand, let's say at point A, we're going to have an equilibrium exchange rate given by E1. So that's the exchange rate diagram. Now, next we have to talk about how inflation is going to sort of flow on through this diagram. Now, before we go through to the text, I'll just quickly tell you the way I see how high inflation is going to affect this diagram, how it's going to affect the demand for Turkish lira. If your country has high inflation, that means stuff and things is becoming more expensive, including your exports. So if your exports become more expensive, then foreigners are going to buy less of them because they can afford to buy less of them. And so therefore the demand for your exports are going to fall. And if they're not going to buy your exports, then they're not going to buy your currency, because the only reason why they want your currency is to buy your exports. So the fall in the demand for exports will lead to a fall in the demand for Turkish lira. And so therefore the demand curve in this exchange rate diagram is going to shift backwards. And so here we can see how that fall will result in a reduction in the demand for Turkish lira. And equilibrium is going to move from point A to point B. And as a result, the exchange rate is going to fall from E1 to E2, and that's going to cause a depreciation of the exchange rate. Okay, so that's the thinking. Now we have to explain that in like 5 or 6 lines. Okay, so this is what I've got written down. A high rate of domestic inflation will make Turkish exports less attractive as prices rise and domestically manufactured goods become more expensive. Other countries will buy less Turkish lira, and the demand for Turkish lira will fall from DTRY1 to DTR2. And equilibrium will move from A to B, which is shown in the diagram below. Therefore, the Turkish lira will depreciate. So unfortunately, they don't give you a lot of space. So you got to be super efficient with your explanation. But yeah, main thing to explain here is high inflation will lead to less exports, and therefore it will lead to less demand for the currency, and then the exchange rate is going to fall, i.e. depreciate, because of that high inflation. Good? All right, let's move on. Okay, so in this next part of the part 7 of this second question, Turkey earned more than US $2.6 billion from exports of carpets in 2020. Sure. So we've got this table, and it shows us the exchange rate from the Turkish lira to the euro from January to August 2022. Okay, so we've got 3 different years and got 3 different exchange rates. What do we have to do? So in part 7, the price of a Turkish carpet exported to Italy in August 2022 was 120,000 Turkish liras. Using the information in table 5, calculate the price of the carpet in euros. Assume no indirect tax has been applied. Okay, so what we have to do is essentially we've got to do a straight up conversion, right? What is 120,000 Turkish lira equivalent to in euros? So the way we do this is we essentially take the price of the item in Turkish lira and we multiply it by the exchange rate, and that's going to give us the, multiply divide by the exchange rate, right? Depending on how you set this thing up, and that's going to give us the equivalent price in euros. So this is where it kind of gets a little bit tricky. Like here, we've been given the exchange rate in Turkish lira to euro. So do you multiply you got this price of 120,000. Do you multiply by the exchange rate, or do you divide by the exchange rate? So this is one way that I find sort of handy to keep in mind, like how do you like what numbers go where. So I'm going to start by saying, okay, the exchange rate is expressed in Turkish lira to euros, right? So you got the ratio is lira to euro. What you want then is you want to maintain that same ratio when you're looking at the price. So the price should therefore be in Turkish lira to euro, right? So we're going to keep Turkish lira on top, and we're going to put euros on the bottom. So the ratio is kind of maintained. Now, what we have is we have the price in Turkish lira, that's 120,000, and we also have this exchange rate, which is so August 2022 is 18.1. So we've got the price in, let me just draw this thing. So we've got that exchange rate, and we have this price in euros. what we're trying to figure out, therefore, sorry, the price in Turkish lira. What we're trying to figure out, therefore, is the price in euro. So in order to maintain this, you need to do a bit of algebra. So what we do here is I'm going to take this guy over here, and I'm going to boot it to this side of the equation. So I'm going to multiply both sides by the price in euro, and then at the same time, I'm going to take this entire thing, this entire exchange rate, and I'm going to boot it down here. So we're going to have to divide by the exchange rate. Yeah, so once we've done that sort of swapping or that sort of algebraic manipulation, we're going to end up with this version of the formula over here. So we've got price in euros on the left-hand side is equal to price in Turkish liras divided by the exchange rate, which is expressed as the ratio between Turkish lira to euros. So once we have those numbers in place, we take the 120,000, which is the price in Turkish lira, and got 18.1, which is the exchange rate, put it onto the denominator. We've got 120,000 divided by 18.1, and that's going to give us 6,629.83 euros. So if you have any space left over, it's generally, I think, good practice just to answer the question. So we say, okay, so the price of the carpet in euros is 6,629 and 83 cents, or euros. Okay, so that's part 7. When we move down to this next part of the question, it's more of the same. When carpets are sold in Italy, the seller must add indirect tax to the price. The rate of indirect tax is 22%. Calculate indirect tax collected on the sale of a more valuable carpet sold for 11,316, including any indirect tax in Italy. Okay, so the way we're going to do this is we need to figure out the actual amount of, the total sort of dollar amount, or the euro amount, as it were, of tax that's being paid. So to figure out how much tax has been paid, we take the final price, which is the price including the tax, and we subtract the original price, which is the price without the tax. We have the final price. The final price that was paid was 11,316. So we have the final price. What we don't have is we don't have the original price, and we don't have the tax paid. Because once we figure out the original price, so we don't have this original price. Once we figure that out, we can actually figure out the tax amount that's being paid, because we just subtract one to the other. Okay, so then how do we figure out the original price? So what I've got here is, I've said the final price is equal to 1 times the tax rate times the original price. If you're not sure how this works, think about it. I'm going to find a blank working space. So think about it this way. Let's say you have something that's $1, and I say this is the base price. It's $1, and I'm going to charge you like a 10% tax. So the final price that you pay is going to be $1 plus, let's say, 10%, 0.1 of your $1. We can see that, so in other words, P plus the tax rate times the original price is going to be equal to the final price. So what we can do is we kind of factorize this thing. If I take 1 plus T out of the equation, we can sort of, because you can see there's actually a 1 in front of that P. So if I take 1 plus T out of the equation, we're going to end up, the final price is equal to 1 plus T times the original price. Yeah, so not sure if that makes any sense, but essentially that's what's happening when we sort of have this equation, this version of the equation up here. So final price is equal to 1 plus tax times the original price. So all we have to do is solve for the original price. So the final price is 11,316. So we'll sub that in here. And we know that the tax is equal to 22% or 0.22. So we can stick it in there. So we now have 11,316 times 1.22, the original price. So if we solve for the original price is therefore equal to 11,316 divided by 1.22, which is equal to 9,275. Okay, so now that we've got that original price, we can then stick that back into this equation over here, and we can say that the tax paid is the final price, which is 11,316, minus the original price, which is 9,275, and so the difference is equal to 2,040. $2,040.59. So again, if you have any spare room at the bottom, you can just kind of write like a single sentence. The tax that's being collected is €2,040.59. Okay, so yeah, I hope that makes sense. Let's move on to the next and I think final part of. Okay, so the final part of this question, part B, is asking us to use the text/data provided and your knowledge of economics to recommend a policy which could be introduced by the government of Turkey to reduce the rate of inflation in Turkey. So remember, we talked about that inflation problem in one of the earlier bits of this question, where we see that Turkey's got high inflation, and rather than raise interest rates, they reduced interest rates, and that was a policy of concern because that could actually fuel inflation. Okay, so here, this is why I kind of like answering it this way, because it kind of links back to the question that we had before. So typically the way that now there's different ways to answer this question. So the main thing is to think about it through the lens of an aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So if you can imagine, you've got the aggregate demand curve and you've got the aggregate supply curve, and you want to reduce inflation. You can do this either by reducing the demand side. That would probably so you can reduce inflation by reducing the demand side. Now, how do you reduce the aggregate demand curve? Well, you can achieve that using either monetary policy or fiscal policy. So fiscal policy is where the government just kind of spends less or saves more. Or increases taxes, and that's going to reduce aggregate demand. But I prefer monetary policy because I think it's easier to explain. So kind of from a strategy point of view, I would prefer to explain monetary policy over fiscal policy. And one thing to keep in mind is that throughout these explanations, you want to invoke as much of the theory as possible. So you want to bring in as much of that theory. And so the main theory here is going to be the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, as well as, I guess, the way monetary policy works and how it operates through, let's say, the market for loanable funds. Okay, so this is what I've got written down here. One solution is contraction monetary policy. The goal is to reduce money supply and raise interest rates, ultimately reducing aggregate demand, causing inflation to fall. Right, so this first paragraph, we start off by saying, this is what the solution is, right? This, in a nutshell, if I had to explain this as succinctly as possible, this is it, right? Now that we've got this out of the way, we now explain, this is the what, right? The next bit is to explain how does that policy work. So how does monetary policy work to bring about that reduction in inflation? Okay, so here's what I've got in the second part. By selling bonds via open market operations, the money supply is reduced and less cash is available in the market for loanable funds. For a given level of money demand, ceteris paribus, interest rates will rise, resulting in a direct and indirect effect. Now, this part is, I'm just explaining like specifically how monetary policy works and how it has these two effects. Now, you don't really have to go into this level of detail. I think this is kind of more potentially kind of like maybe first year university kind of level. But if you can explain that you can pull this off, then it would really, really kind of show off your knowledge to the examiners. Okay, so the direct effect is that the cost of borrowing increases, which reduces investment spending. And since aggregate demand equals C plus I plus G plus NX, as investment levels decrease, aggregate demand also decreases, causing inflation to fall via the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So here we're saying that because aggregate demand is made up of these four bits, C, I, G, and X, whatever you can do to kind of reduce any one of these four things, you're going to bring about this reduction in aggregate demand. So high interest rates means borrowing is more expensive, therefore investment is more expensive, therefore there'll be less investment spending. And if there's less investment spending, then there's going to be less aggregate demand since it's one of the four bits or one of the four components of aggregate demand. So that's what I call the direct effect. The indirect effect is going to occur through the consumption channel, or the C bit. So this is what I've written. The indirect effect, this occurs through household spending. As interest rates rise, mortgages, i.e. home loans, become more expensive to service, leaving less funds for discretionary spending. Consumption decreases, and since aggregate demand equals C plus I plus G plus NX, as consumption levels decrease, aggregate demand also decreases, causing inflation to fall via the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So once again, the kind of like similar rationale, we're going to use the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, I'm going to say that because aggregate demand is made up of these four things, C, I, G, and X, if you reduce consumption spending in this case, then you're going to cause that reduction in aggregate demand. Now, how do you reduce consumption spending? How do high interest rates reduce private sector consumption? Well, it does this through, let's say, debt obligations like mortgages and home loans. So if interest rates are high, then mortgages are going to become more expensive to service, and so households will have less money at the end of every month to spend on stuff and things. Therefore, they will spend less on stuff and things. That will bring consumption levels down, and aggregate demand will fall, and that's going to reduce inflation levels via the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Now, if you were to end it here, I think that's sufficient. I think that's kind of showing quite a high level of understanding. But if you I just wanted to, kick like an extra goal. If you want to show off a little bit more, you can also sort of mention some of the limitations of this approach, right? So what are some of the potential problems of using this contraction monetary policy? So here I've said, however, a fall in aggregate demand might cause a rise in unemployment and potential recessionary gap. Also, the Turkish central bank must be able to operate independently from the government. So here we're saying that if you go a little bit too hard with the contraction monetary policy, you're going to pull that aggregate demand curve too far to the left, and you're going to end up with unemployment and potential recession. Also, the central bank itself must be able to operate independently from government. They have to be free from any kind of government intervention. Otherwise, as soon as they raise interest rates, governments will just tell them to lower it again. So it's really important that central banks are actually, or rather the central bank independence is actually protected, and that they are free to operate and do what's necessary to fix the economy. Okay, so that about does it for this second question of the 2024 May paper 3. I hope you guys found this useful, and see you in the next one. Bye.